Good day, everyone. So in this episode, we are going to dive into the alarming issue of sextortion and other cyber-related dangers affecting young people today. We'll explore how these crimes happen, the emotional and legal consequences for victims and perpetrators, and what young people can do to stay safe.
So we have with us here Miss Andiesa West, whose background is legal standing, and Miss Emily Bachan, whose expertise is in mental health and conflict resolution. So in order for us to even delve into these issues in the first place, we would like our listeners or viewers to get a general understanding of sextortion and all the details behind it then.
Okay. So recently, my colleague and I, Emily, we participated in the Yes Leadership program hosted by the women parliamentarians of Trinidad and Tobago. And the topic that we actually debated was sextortion. So I think that it would be necessary for us to distinguish between sextortion as defined by the International Association of Women Judges and then the more commonly understood definition of sextortion as used in the United States. So firstly, the International Association of Women Judges, they define sextortion as sexual abuse and corruption perpetrated by persons in authority who abuse their authority to demand sexual favors in exchange for something within their power that they could grant or withhold. So essentially, it is like an intersection between corruption and sexual abuse, where someone in authority is abusing their power to demand sexual favors from someone. And for an example, just examples, it could be if they are demanding sexual favors in exchange for granting an application for a house or even to enter our country. And then the other definition kind of concerns demanding cash or further sexual images by threatening the person to release images that they may have, evidence of sexual images or content that they may have. Yeah.
Emily, what would you...
Yeah, and build on what Andiesa is saying, sextortion, we see it is actually a form of online blackmail. When we look at the cyber threats itself, in which the perpetrators, they threaten to release intimate images and information unless their demands are being met. And sometimes, if not monetary, but of course, using sexual favors. And they use different tactics, such as social engineering, where the perpetrators, they build trust with their victims on social media or even dating platforms.
Like Tinder.
Yeah. And another tactic that we see perpetrators use is data manipulation. So once they have that explicit information or content, they tend to share it and then use it as leverage and hold that against the victims. And of course, like Andiesa said, I'm just echoing the psychological corrosion, where threats of public exposure and humiliation or even reputational damage can be made to ensure that there's compliance between the victim and the perpetrator. So that is what we see sextortion is a form of online blackmail.
That's the first time I heard about that engineering one. But what are the most common tactics used by perpetrators?
Well, the most common would be essentially where they are asking the first contact, the initial contact with them online, where they're asking for intimate photos, videos, and things like that. Yeah.
And to add what Emily is saying, there are different ways in which they could obtain this evidence of sexual images or content from persons. So the person could hack into your computer or your devices and gain access to any sexually explicit content that you may have on these devices. And even if you think that you may not be someone who has those type of content on your devices, they could also hack into your computer, gain access to your camera, and then when you're changing your clothes or even engaging in sexual activity in the privacy of your home, they could also be taking content unknowingly to you.
I guess that's why cybersecurity is so important as well, because a lot of people, myself included, just put passwords like with my name and 3 numbers, and if you do that, I guess they could hack into it a lot easier.
And to add to one point, the technology's role itself with encrypted messaging apps, the anonymity enhancing platforms that actually shields the perpetrator from investigators getting more in depth. That is actually another point.
So when you're thinking that you're protecting yourself with these encryption, it's also making our protective services job harder when they are actually trying to get the perpetrators who are doing these acts.
Double-edged sword, okay. Okay, so then given that we have this understanding and then we see the exposure to the risk, what are some ways in which young people then can protect themselves from these online predators?
Yeah, so the first thing that I want to note is that while doing research for this podcast, one of the things that I saw, which was troubling to me, was the fact that a majority of the perpetrators are men and a majority of the victims are young boys, which could be a recipe for disaster in Trinidad and Tobago, where we aren't particularly tolerant to the LGBTQ community. And recently I read an article which said that 2 teens in Trinidad and Tobago, they committed suicide, and that suicide was also linked to sextortion. So the issue is so complex that also demands a complex approach to deal with it, by engaging all and different actors in our society to deal with issues. So Ministry of Education could adopt programs to sensitize these children about the dangers of sextortion and the risk of interacting with strangers online, and not just strangers but persons generally. The National Parent Teachers Association, they could also engage with their membership, the parents, to educate them about the dangers of sextortion for their children.
That's all well and good, but what about social media, the role of social media platform itself? How could they prevent cyber exploitation?
So on social media, that is exactly the playground of the perpetrators. So we have to meet them exactly where they are. So if they are using it to reach our children, then we could use it to counteract their efforts. Educate these children about the dangers of sextortion and the risk of interacting with these strangers and persons online. So using social media to our advantage, since we recognize that we can't necessarily take the children away from social media, so we just use it to our advantage in the interim.
That, the how to catch a predator. I think someone in Trinidad tried that on TikTok as well.
We're talking a lot here now about strangers, but we do have a lot of cases where it is actually family members that are committing this. So Emily, can you give us a take on that?
So I think that if young persons are facing sextortion or any form of abuse in that matter in the home, they need to essentially go to the point where they can find someone on the outside that they trust. Building trust with someone like a guidance counselor, a teacher, even your peers, your friends, somebody. You must have somebody that you could talk to. And I think if you could strengthen that relationship, you would be able to, move somewhere in a place where you feel comfortable to start talking about what is actually happening in the home. Because I know, of course, in the family, it would be difficult to go to, let's say, an aunt or uncle, because
so how do we
they're going to hush it up, right?
A safe digital environment. How would you ideally create a safe digital environment for youth?
Okay, so for youths, essentially, if you're using social media platforms, of course, there are privacy settings. You have to learn your digital applications, and there are tons of ways that you could protect yourself and strengthen your privacy settings itself, and be cautious with that personal information that you're putting out there. So if you don't want strangers to, see certain things that are, perhaps intimate, or, it's just your personal information, you can put settings and boundaries to that. So setting boundaries, that's like the first thing in teaching our young people and educating them how to use and practice using their social media in a wise way, and of course educating them and getting good content, so they consume good things and not negative things, so it doesn't impact them.
That would tie into what Andiesa said with the education, but we would need to do it from a more early age, like infantile age.
Prevention is always better than
Thank you.
Instead of dealing with like reactive measures. How about the preventative measures to ensure that it doesn't happen in the first place? Then
the tablet these
And I
days.
mean, it starts at home, and it goes back to parenting as well, because parents have to also take the initiative to supervise our young persons that have access to a device. That is so crucial. So, yeah.
Okay, and so I feel like we're talking a lot about the risk, the exposure, the consequences then of it. But I'm going to direct this question here to the legal person in the room, and I want to know about the legal consequences for these offenders. Yes?
So the issue is that we don't necessarily have any standalone pieces of legislation that deals directly with sextortion. So what we essentially have to do is try to force the crime into the existing pieces of legislation. And the perpetrators know that there are these gaps, these imprecise fits that they could use to their advantage. But at the same time, if you are currently experiencing sextortion, there are some resources available to you. So for instance, the Trafficking in Persons Act that act defines sexual exploitation as compelling a person to engage in the production of pornography or child pornography or pornographic material. So if a perpetrator essentially compels a child to send images of themselves or videos of themselves to this person, it could possibly be included as sexual exploitation under the Trafficking in Persons Act.
Yeah, but that's possibly and probably and what if and what happens
Yes.
then. There's no guarantee.
That's
What about
exactly it.
fines and imprisonment? Do we have any of those?
Right, so currently the fines are very small, but I did see that we are trying to introduce, or at least there's currently the cybercrime bill, which seeks to introduce new offenses that deals directly with the issue of sextortion. So for instance, it includes, or at least creates, the offense of using a computer to extort explicit content of somebody for their benefit. And the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2024, which also seeks to introduce an offense of taking and sharing or threatening to share intimate images of another person. But even in the US, the fines that are attached to these particular crimes are kind of so small. So one of the cases, the perpetrator was a young man in Nigeria, actually. And so they had to extradite the person to the United States. And I believe even though the child committed suicide, the penalty was 10 years in prison. And a child lost their life. So we kind of have to take a better approach to dealing with this issue and recognizing that it is a serious issue with serious consequences, and the penalties should also match the severity of the crime. Yeah.
Speaking of the mental health side now, I'll direct it to Emily. How would the victims of sextortion seek help and support after the fact that it's happened?
Right. So before I even answer that question, I wanted to talk a little bit about the emotional impact that it has on the victims. As we can see, that it's a very traumatic experience, especially to a young person. And that trauma and anxiety, victims often experience severe emotional distress, including anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation, where they would actually feel like they can't even talk about anything because they're scared, they're living in fear. So that question that you're asking about, how do they get that support? How do they move on, go about their lives normal after that? There's social stigma that is attached to that. So that fear of judgment, going out into the public, what everybody would be talking about, you see that girl or you see that boy, what happened to them? I hear, and people talk, and that will make a victim feel a sense of reluctancy to seek the help, right? And then, of course, the loss of trust and in the systems itself that we have in Trinidad and Tobago.
So what resources we have now?
I would say the resources that we have for young people, we currently just launched, me and Daniel, we are actually focal points from UNICEF, and Let's Unpack It, where we launched www.youngcaribbeanminds.com. That website essentially has tons of information, and this is a directory that we have here, and this has a lot of information of the hotlines that they could go and they can find for specific scenarios or cases, and especially those who are victims of sextortion. It would be beneficial if they go and they look for that help, and if they don't know, they can get a friend or the colleague or the guidance counselors in the schools to help them find the right specific personnel then to help them in a scenario like that.
Because it's one thing, I feel like one of the issues we face mainly, and I would say worldwide, is we're talking consequences, we're talking risk, and we're talking the ramifications. But in order for all of these things to even become a thing, the onus is on the individual to even speak up in the first place. And we all know generally, I guess, as women or as younger people in society, speaking up. So I feel like the role society can play generally is that we need to take these things seriously. And we need to not laugh at somebody when it is they expose an issue or say that, I experienced such and such, because in order for all of this to even take place, the bill to be implemented or an act of parliament or something, it has to be that we see it as a real issue that people are facing.
Most Trinidadians see it as a joke. I mean, if a young man comes out and say, I'm being sexually exploited by a next older man, everybody going to laugh, because that's just the sad reality. So it's more about what we can do as a society together to curb this issue.
That's why I think In addition to implementing measures to prevent sextortion from happening in the first place, we also need to create safe spaces and safeguards to help the victims when they do fall prey to the perpetrators, because we don't want them to think that, okay, this happened, these images might get out, and my only solution is to commit suicide. So we need to definitely merge the two mechanisms in order to create the best environment to deal with this issue of sextortion.
Right.
Yeah.
So for the purpose of our listeners and viewers, we're here discussing the issue of sextortion. My co-host, Mr. Daniel Lutchman, Janessa Campbell. We have our two guests with us here who gave us a broad, in-depth definition of sextortion. We're exploring the issues. We have Miss Andiesa West with her legal background and Miss Emily Bachan with mental health and conflict resolution as her expertise. So we explored the role social media plays. We explored if there's any legal consequences. We're going to take it one step further now and explore all the ways in which society can work together here now to reduce the cyber-related dangers.
Right. So the first thing we have to do is recognize the warning signs. We have to be able to understand what are the signs itself in which the perpetrators that, we see it online, if they are creating fake accounts, there's phishing, scams, these types of things on the social platform itself. And our young people have to be aware. That's the main thing. They have to be very aware of these types of people that are using social media for that negative resources in that sense, right? And of course, reporting suspicious behavior. If you are on your platform and you notice that there's this random account that keeps messaging you and they're sending you images too, and videos, and then they're asking you to send, then that's a cause for concern. You need to report it directly. You can go to the TTPS. There's the victim unit as well for support. You can, go to your NGOs. There's many in different communities in Trinidad and Tobago. We have so much support and resources on the grassroots end where you can talk about it. If you're feeling ashamed or you're feeling how to tell mommy and daddy, or even in the school or even with your friends, if you're feeling like you're just uncomfortable to talk about it, because I know the topic of sex can be very taboo for some young persons still,
and not only,
right?
Taboo is the fact that there's a ticklish issue because of trust, We're concentrating a lot on strangers, and that is the riskiest. But to me, a lot of the cases I hear of sextortion, there's victim blaming in it. So you have a case where you have a boyfriend or you have a girlfriend and you're intimate at a point in time and things go south, right? And a couple of months later, we're saying that for. It's always, you should have never do this in the first place. So we're now concentrating on whose fault it is in the first place. So that is our next inclination somebody might have to not reach out, because I don't want somebody to say, this is my fault, I shouldn't have done that. Yes, I'm aware of that, but how can we help after the fact then, So it's a very ticklish issue on a whole.
What Janessa just described is revenge porn. And we actually have cases in Trinidad and Tobago that dealt directly with that issue of revenge porn, such as Teresa and Nandel Simmons, where Teresa was able to gain damages because he released the sexual images that she sent to him in confidence. So don't think that is all gloom. We actually have some mechanism in place to deal with these issues that persons may be facing. And for instance, even if you go to a police officer and the police officer don't take you seriously because it's a young man who just sent images to an older man, we also have the Todd-Lampkin decision where the court recognized that the state actors has a positive duty to take steps to protect our citizens, and if they don't, they're violating the rights of these citizens. So we have things in place, and if you don't get the recourse that you want, go to the courts and get the recourse that you actually need. Force these actors to actually do what they are supposed to do.
So when this happens in the home now, I know we mentioned it briefly before, but when it happens in the home, what do you, Emily, recommend as coping mechanisms for these persons? We talked about the resources and what they could go to, but what can they do internally?
So internally, I would say the first thing they have to do is work on themselves in accepting what has happened, what has transpired. Even though it's an unfortunate circumstance, the first thing they need to do is essentially make peace within themselves. Because if you don't do that, you're going to find yourself beating up about it, and it could be very detrimental to your mental health and your physical health, and the list will go on. You will just end up getting a lot of health issues. And within that, the coping mechanisms can be a range of things. What will work for one person, a victim of sextortion, from another, it will vary. So you have to find things that would make you feel more alive, worth living, and understand that you are worthy of life, and despite what has happened to you, it's okay, like you can still bounce back and be that resilient individual. Because we are a multifaceted type of people in Trinidad, and general. And yeah.
I can't believe this happened to me. Like,
yeah.
They can't be doing this.
And sometimes people fall into that pattern where they just put themselves down after that happens, and then they can't seem to live a normal life.
I think that's the suicide aspect of things.
Right, and then, exactly, and that's where we see on the news itself, it is something that is rampant, where they feel like there's no hope, they're ambivalent, and they feel as if, well, there's nothing for me after this, like I'm destroyed, and I think if they can, find ways to, alleviate themselves and bring themselves to that higher self-esteem, to recognize that, it's okay, like, I've been a victim of this, but that doesn't define my story.
In a healthy manner, of course.
Yeah.
A lot of people would turn to crime because, the streets comforting them, or drugs or alcohol, which we don't want.
Of course, and that's what I'm saying. Like, younger persons can go into art, go into the culture, paint, draw, sing,
channel
that energy into something that will create something good. Yeah.
Destroy you in that process. Then,
Because as much as in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the sexually explicit content in our songs, and we can be very sexually explicit generally.
That's Caribbean culture.
Yeah.
Right now,
But when it comes to actually talking about sex itself, that's when it's like, okay, this is too much. This is too taboo. So persons.
What do you think is the social norm around this whole issue within Trinidad and Tobago?
The social norm within sextortion or sex generally, I feel as though we don't necessarily recognize that it is a big issue in Trinidad and Tobago, because firstly, persons not coming out to talk about it. Even if you may have received threats that persons are threatening to, release these intimate photos of you, you probably wouldn't go and tell anybody because you're so shamed by the fact, especially if you're a female, you're so ashamed. Your reputation is at risk. Am I going to be able to live? So I think that if we are able to change the culture and allow persons to actually have these conversations, or at least safe spaces so that we could have these open dialogue here, then we would be able to get greater insight into the issue, and we would be able to tackle what exactly the issue is, because we have to know what we're dealing with before we are able to.
Especially with women, I think a lot of men in Trinidad view women mainly for their bodies, and their body is their value. So from the time they know that your body has been devalued, in their mind they devalue completely. So I think that culture is a huge, huge point to deal with that stigma.
Speaks up.
You're the problem. Immediately. Why did you send those pictures in the first place?
Emphasis is always placed on the woman's role in it, and not what the consequences. I feel like more so we need to be more receptive to a situation and have understanding where this is concerned. Because I feel like we hear about situations all the time, and I always say today for them, tomorrow for me. Because you never know when you could be a victim of something, guys. Like come on, So there we go. You never know if something could fall in your court at some point, and we act as if we sit on a high horse a lot of times, and we say, well, that happening to me and that didn't do this, but never. That's, you're saying that now, but you never know. That's the. So I feel like the shame in speaking up is due to the fact that it's not being received in the first place. So that's where the shame developed from. So that's something we need to take a holistic approach then as a nation. And by extension, because we look at the US and the whatever, we take patterns sometimes, and you see court cases, and if you watch Judge Judy, whatever, you see all these people who come in forward, and they exposing, they want like the give me details. I'm not saying that women don't lie, so that's the next side of things as well. If it is we have to be very careful here, because if we create legislation, there are some women who might use it to their advantage there now. So
There's a very thin line.
There we go. So we have to be very careful.
Women out there.
All right.
No, I mean, it's the truth. It have some crazy ones out there.
Of one or two women lying
and saying, no, he did that.
Who are probably experiencing sextortion.
Yeah. Correct. So in a man's defense now, if that happens, what does the legislation, or what should the legislation say about that?
I feel as though if somebody wrongfully accuses you of something, well, that's a crime in itself.
Right.
And then if someone goes on social media and accuses you of doing something, that's defamation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have ways in which you could get back at a woman.
Of course, the evidence will always show.
Yeah.
Ways.
Sextortion is gender neutral.
There we go. Yeah.
So even though we probably have highlighted sextortion as it relates to women and as it relates to young children, this crime doesn't discriminate. It could affect anyone, including men.
Men are affected. Yeah. And then we could go a step further and even talk about the fact that even though men will experience it, they might be the ones more cautious to step forward. Because as a man, you don't want to be able to say, I was a victim of something. Men sometimes don't like to put up their hands and say, this has happened to me. And especially if there's a male involved as well, I don't want anybody to know that this happened. I don't want to, quote unquote, be considered emasculated then. So I feel like men speaking up there now. Because I heard that you could correct me if I'm wrong, the suicide rates for men and the depression rates in men are actually increasing. So yes, we're focusing on sextortion because it's women and women, right? Society is for, we trying to help the women. But at the same time, I feel like we're neglecting the men in the process. And that's something we also need to look at.
The suicide rates for men, the ratio has always been higher than women. Yeah.
And that's something that's not exposed as much.
Yeah.
Don't we have in Trinidad one of the highest suicide rates?
For men.
Yeah.
And that's crazy.
Yeah. So I feel like the conversation then could shift to, yes, we're creating legislation to protect, but at the same time, again, the speaking up is the men we need to protect as well in this whole thing. So
two more questions. One, let's say, for the tech companies now, how could they prevent these cybercrimes? What do you think they can do to prevent these cybercrimes?
For instance, we should probably be able to get little blinders on our webcams in 2025. And I feel like
they took that off though. I feel like that was a thing
back in the days. It's a slide,
You need to buy it separately in Amazon. I mean, it's not going to be that expensive. And then, of course, probably be stricter about the age requirements to enter some of the social media.
We have AIs now. I think they can implement AIs for certain words, certain materials to detect images.
Yeah.
You did say age restrictions, but then let's be real, this is happening amongst the adults as well. So everybody's experiencing this kind of thing.
It's not just young people.
But we need to safeguard some of the more vulnerable sectors of our society even more than the others. So we at least doing that to help the children who may not be as knowledgeable on these things as an adult, to ensure that we don't let them, because we know as soon as a child comes out of the womb, they are on YouTube and they're on a device and they have an iPad and all these different things. So we at least need to create safeguards to protect our children and then generally to safeguard against, all these fake profiles, etc., that may,
making them more aware and informed about the scams that are online.
So before my co-host concludes, I just want some advice for the young folks from legal and from a mental health point of view. Since we started with you at the beginning, let's start with you.
No problem. So some advice to the youths out there and to all our viewers that are watching. Continue to keep yourself informed and aware. When you educate yourself about the good practices and uses of online spaces, it can be very good for you. And then there are the dark sides of things. So you have to be very wary about it and make sure that anything that comes up that is suspicious or is, tackling you, that you report it. Tell somebody that you trust. And essentially you'll be okay.
And I would say to speak up about it so that we could understand the issue that we're dealing with as it relates to men, women, children. And even though we recognize that we need to make some changes in our legislations to deal directly with the issue, there are lots of different avenues that you can explore to help deal with the issue if you're experiencing it right now. There are lots of NGOs, and we could still fit it into one of the existing pieces of legislation. So don't just sit home and take these demands and let it drive you to something like suicide. Actually get up and go do something to combat this very real issue that we are experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
That's what I would say.
As we come to a close, we just want to say thank you to our guests for joining us, Miss Andiesa West and Miss Emily Bachan. We want to tell you guys, keep up the good work. Thank you to my co-host as well, Mr. Lutchman. So we just wanted to emphasize the role that young people, parents, institutions play in bringing this issue to light. And I think the important takeaway here is speaking up and encouraging further and ongoing discussions on digital safety and all of the reporting mechanisms, as the only way we could combat this issue is through awareness, first of all, and then prevention. So we just want to thank you, everybody, and thank you, viewers, and thank you to the listeners.
See you guys next time on the Red House Roundtable.